I
The
really
torque
meant
wrench
what I
clicked
said
in my hand
earlier.
35
Even after all
foot-pounds.
this time, you still
Exactly.
managed to
It was the
surprise
only
me.
sound in the shop
I
that
just
made
want you to
sense.
know how much that means to
Outside,
me.
the city
I
was a
really do
chaotic
feel
stream
like
of
this is
traffic
where
and
we
noise.
belong.
An inefficient
The
system of
warmth of the
movement that wasted
fire
fuel and time.
just makes
Inside
everything
Reyes
clear.
Restorations,
But that's
everything
exactly
had a
my
tolerance
point.
level.
If we
If a piston didn't fit, you machined it until it did. If an electrical harness was frayed, you resoldered the connection. Cause and effect, input and output. The world outside was messy. The world under a hood was binary. It either worked or it didn't. I wiped a smudge of grease from the chrome bumper of the '67 Mustang Fastback and checked the time on my wrist. 5:14 p.m. I was 14 minutes behind schedule on the suspension overhaul, a delay caused by a rusted lower control arm bolt that had required heat and persuasion to remove. My phone buzzed against the metal workbench. I ignored it. Variables like random text messages were the enemy of flow state. It buzzed again. Then a third time. I set the wrench down on the microfiber cloth, ensuring it was parallel to the screwdriver set. I picked up the phone. Professor Taylor, Silas. I need to review your final thesis proposal. Professor Taylor, the campus environment is unconducive. Too many variables. Too much noise. Professor Taylor, I'm at my family's property on Blackwood Lake. Drive up. We can go over the schematics of your paper in a better environment. Bring the Jaguar. It needs a run. I stared at the screen. The syntax was off. Alina Taylor, Professor Taylor, to me didn't send fragmented texts. She spoke in paragraphs that could be published in academic journals. She was precise, brilliant, and usually composed. This text read like a distress signal encoded as a request. I looked at the Jaguar E-Type in the corner of the shop. It was her father's car. I had spent 6 months restoring the electrical system, replacing the rotting Lucas wiring with a modern, heat-resistant harness that I'd custom-braided to look authentic. It was the only reason we knew each other outside of the lecture hall. I was the student in the back row who wore oil-stained boots and turned in papers written with the precision of a technical manual. I was also the mechanic she trusted with her inheritance. "Marco," I called out, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. My apprentice popped his head up from the pit, looking like a grease-covered gopher. "Yeah, boss?" "Lock up. I have a field call." "The Jag?" Marco asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's running perfect. You tuned the carbs yesterday. That engine is singing." "The owner," I corrected. "She thinks it's about a paper. The data suggests a high-stress event. And since grades are due in 3 weeks, I can't afford for my thesis advisor to have a breakdown." I didn't pack books. I packed my diagnostic tablet, a multimeter, a portable jump starter, a laser level, and my canvas tool roll. If Alina Taylor was calling me to a remote location on a Tuesday night to talk about Victorian literature, she was lying to herself. She needed a troubleshooter. The drive to Blackwood Lake took 2 hours of winding asphalt that punished anyone who didn't understand apex management. I drove the shop truck, a reliable diesel rig that could tow a house if the physics were right. The air grew thinner, sharper, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The sun dipped below the tree line, turning the sky a bruised purple. When I pulled onto the gravel drive of the Taylor estate, the visual data was immediately concerning. The house was a sprawling Victorian structure, beautiful in the way a shipwreck is beautiful. The paint was peeling in systematic strips on the north face. The gutters were choked with wet leaves, creating a water diversion issue that would threaten the foundation within 2 freeze-thaw cycles. It was a structure fighting a losing war against entropy. And there, parked crookedly near the rotting porch stairs, was the Jaguar E-Type. The hood was up. Steam, now dissipated into the cold mountain air, had left a sticky residue on the windshield. I killed my engine and stepped out. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the sound of a woman cursing softly from beneath the open hood of a masterpiece. "The thermal expansion coefficient of that radiator cap is unforgiving," I said, announcing my presence before I startled her. Alina jumped, her head snapping up. A smudge of oil sat high on her cheekbone, stark against her pale skin. She was wearing a thick wool cardigan that looked 3 sizes too big, and her hair, usually pinned back in a severe, academic twist, was fraying at the edges. "Silas," she breathed, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You made good time. You said bring the Jaguar. I assumed you meant you needed the Jaguar fixed, not that I should drive another one here." I walked to the car, bypassing the pleasantries. I leaned over the engine bay. The smell of coolant was sweet and cloying. "You overheated." I was trying to get up the driveway, she said, her voice tight. It just stopped, like everything else in my life this week. I looked at her then, really looked. The fatigue around her eyes wasn't just tired, it was structural. She was operating at maximum capacity with zero downtime. Her hands were trembling slightly, vibrating like an engine with a misfire. The car is fine, I said, spotting the loose hose clamp immediately. Simple failure. 2 minutes to fix. I pulled a screwdriver from my pocket. I always carried 3 and tightened the clamp. But the house looks like it's failing code compliance. Alina looked at the looming porch. It's my tenure project. I'm supposed to be editing the final manuscript here. Dean Sterling gave me until Monday to prove I can manage the department grant and my own research. He thinks I'm scattered. Are you? She laughed. A brittle sound that cracked in the cold air. I'm here, aren't I? Freezing, with a broken car, waiting for a student to tell me my thesis is derivative. My thesis is solid, I said calmly. And technically, Professor, I'm only your student for another 21 days. Once that final grade is logged, the hierarchy dissolves. I shut the hood with a solid, reassuring thud. Go inside, Professor. Make tea. I'll move the car. She hesitated, watching me. For a second, the power dynamic shifted. In the classroom, she controlled the flow of information. She stood at the podium. I sat in the back. But here, with grease on her face and a car she couldn't start, she was looking for a variable she could control. She couldn't find one. Thank you, Silas, she whispered, and retreated up the creaking stairs. I watched her go. Step 3 on the porch staircase. Bowed under her weight. Rotten wood. Termites or water damage. Priority 1. Secure the perimeter. The interior of the house was a study in chaotic entropy. Books were stacked in towers on the floor, precarious and swaying. The heating system was banging hydronic hammer, likely air in the pipes. It was 55 degrees inside, Max. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and anxiety. Alina was in the kitchen, staring at a kettle on a gas stove that refused to light. Propane tank is likely low, I said, dropping my heavy tool roll on the oak table. Or the regulator is frozen. She turned, her shoulders slumped. I just wanted a cup of tea. Is that too much to ask of the universe? The universe is indifferent to your hydration needs. The regulator, however, can be adjusted. I walked past her. The proximity was a physical force, the scent of vanilla and the sharp metallic tang of the coolant she'd been near. I kept my hands deep in my pockets to ensure I didn't reach out to steady her. That boundary was still live. Why did you really ask me here? I asked, moving to the stove. I fiddled with the burner. No hiss. I checked the line behind the stove. Kinked. I told you. Your paper. You could have emailed notes. You grade digitally. You hate handwritten drafts. I straightened the line. The gas hissed. I hit the igniter. Whoosh. Blue flame. You're overwhelmed. You needed a buffer. She wrapped her arms around herself, watching the flame. Dean Sterling is coming on Friday for a site visit. He claims he wants to see the historic property the university is considering for a retreat center, but he's coming to see if I'm capable of maintaining it. If the house is a wreck, he pulls the grant. If he pulls the grant, I don't get tenure. And the house is a wreck. It's a disaster, she admitted, her voice cracking. I can analyze Joyce, Silas. I can deconstruct postmodernism. I cannot fix a leaking roof or a boiler that sounds like a dying whale. I tried to hire someone, but they're booked until spring. Competence is domain-specific, I said. You handle the words. I'll handle the hardware. You're my student. I can't ask you to. I own a business, Alina. The use of her first name hung in the air, unauthorized but necessary. My hourly rate is significant. But for this week, I accept payment and access to the library archives for my research. Deal? She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a hidden clause in the contract. There wasn't one. I just wanted the system to run smooth. I wanted her to run smooth. Deal, she whispered. I nodded. Good. Put on a coat. It's going to get colder before I get the heat back on. I spent the next 4 hours in what I called the zone. The boiler wasn't dying. The pilot assembly was dirty. I dismantled it, cleaned the thermocouple with a wire brush, and resequenced the ignition. The flame shifted from a jagged orange to a clean, efficient blue. The banging stopped. Heat began to radiate through the cast iron radiators, a slow, steady pulse of life returning to the house. I moved to the porch. The third step was indeed compromised. I found some scrap lumber in the shed, old, seasoned oak, and used the tools in my truck to reinforce the stringer and replace the tread. I worked efficiently, measuring twice, cutting once. The saw's whine echoed off the lake, a sound of order imposed on chaos. When I came back inside, the sun had fully set. The temperature had risen to 68 degrees. Alina was sitting at the dining table, surrounded by papers. She had a pen in her hand, but she wasn't writing. She was watching me. "It's quiet," she said. "Entropy requires energy to combat," I said. Washing my hands at the sink, I applied energy. The noise stopped. "You make it sound so simple." It is. Mechanics don't have subtext. Either the bolt is tight or it isn't. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit, please. I actually did read your draft." I sat. This was the dangerous part. The machinery I understood. The woman across from me, with the loose hair and the intelligent, terrified eyes, was a complex algorithm I hadn't cracked yet. She pushed a paper toward me. It was covered in red ink. My stomach tightened. "Your thesis relies heavily on the mechanical evolution of the assembly line," she said, her voice shifting into professor mode. "But you're missing the human element. The ghost in the machine. Why do we restore things, Silas? Is it to make them work? Or to prove we can turn back time?" I looked at her notes. They were brilliant. Incisive. She saw the flaw in my logic instantly. "Efficiency," I countered. "A restored machine is an optimized machine." "Is it?" She leaned forward. "Or is it an act of love? To take something broken and refuse to let it be trash?" The question hung there. I looked at her hands, ink-stained and trembling slightly. "Maybe," I said softly. "Maybe it's about proving that the damage isn't the definition." Her eyes softened. "That's your thesis, Silas. Write that." For the first time all day, the tension in her shoulders dropped. She reached for her tea, which was now hot, thanks to the boiler, and took a sip. "Thank you," she said, not looking at the paper, but at the radiator hissing gently in the corner. "For the heat. Thermal regulation is essential for cognitive function," I said, keeping my tone flat to hide the fact that I wanted to cover her hand with mine. The next 2 days fell into a rhythm. A routine. I woke at 6 a.m. I made coffee strong, black, precisely measured. I rehung the loose shutters that banged in the wind. I replaced the washers in the kitchen faucet so it stopped dripping. Alina worked in the library. Sometimes, I would look up from a repair and see her watching me through the window. She wouldn't wave. She would just look, a small smile playing on her lips, before returning to her books. It wasn't romantic. It was functional. But in that function, there was an intimacy I wasn't prepared for. It was the intimacy of shared space, of parallel work. I was the firewall. She was the data. On Thursday afternoon, I was in the library, measuring the bookshelves for a brace support. Alina was on the floor, surrounded by manuscripts. "Dean Sterling emailed," she said, her voice small. "He's bringing the university architect with him tomorrow." "Let them come," I said, marking a stud on the wall. "The structure is sound." "He hates me, Silas. He thinks I'm a relic, like this house. He thinks I should be replaced by someone younger, someone who publishes digital media instead of analyzing Victorian prose." She stood up, pacing. "I'm 36 years old. I have a PhD, and I feel like a fraud every time I walk into that faculty lounge." I set my pencil down. I turned to face her. "You're not a fraud. You're just running incompatible software." She stopped pacing. "Excuse me? The university wants fast, cheap content. You provide deep structural analysis. You're a V12 engine in a world of electric scooters. It's not that you're broken, Alina. It's that they don't know how to drive you." She stared at me. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. "That is the most mechanic thing anyone has ever said to me. Is it wrong?" She shook her head. "No." She took a step toward me. "Silas, The house groaned. A deep, ominous sound from above. The wind outside had picked up. The sky was turning a slate gray. "Barometric pressure is dropping," I said, glancing at the window. "Fast." "What does that mean?" "It means the forecast was wrong. We're not getting a flurry. It looks like a lake effect system. The kind of microclimate anomaly the local models always underestimate. The storm hit at midnight. It wasn't just snow. It was a wall of white noise and violence. The wind slammed into the house like a physical blow, rattling the frames I had just tightened. I was sleeping on the couch in the library. Alina was upstairs in the master bedroom. I was awake instantly. I counted the seconds between the flash of lightning and the thunder. Then, a sound that wasn't weather. A tear, a crash, and the scream of twisting metal. Silas. I was moving before she finished my name. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my bare feet finding purchase on the wood. I burst into her room. She was standing by the bay window, clutching a blanket to her chest. A massive branch from the ancient oak outside had sheared off and smashed through the upper sash. Snow and freezing wind were pouring into the room, swirling around her like a vortex. "Get back," I ordered, my voice cutting through the wind. I grabbed her arm, gentle but firm, and pulled her away from the glass. Her skin was ice cold. "My papers," she gasped, looking at the desk near the window. "The manuscript. The wind will scatter them." "Go to the hall," I commanded. I didn't wait. I grabbed the heavy duvet from the bed and threw it over the desk, weighing down the corners with a heavy brass lamp and a stack of books. Then I turned to the window. The hole was significant, 3 feet by 2 feet. The wind was a pressure hose. I scanned the room. Resources. I grabbed the heavy wardrobe door. It was loose anyway, one of the things I hadn't fixed yet, and ripped it off its hinges. I shoved it against the broken frame, using my shoulder to hold it against the gale. "Alina, I need duct tape. In my bag. Downstairs. Kitchen table." She stared at me, frozen. "Alina, execute." The command snapped her out of it. She ran. 30 seconds later, she was back, the roll of silver tape in her shaking hand. "Tape the edges while I hold it," I gritted out. The wind was fighting me, a live thing trying to enter. My shoulder burned with the effort. She worked fast, tearing strips with her teeth, sealing the gap between the wardrobe door and the wall. We worked in tandem, a unit. I provided the force, she provided the seal. When the last strip was in place, the howling dropped to a dull roar. The room was safe. We stood there in the semi-darkness, breathing hard. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting her. "You're freezing," I said. I didn't think." "Don't think. Reset." I steered her out of the room and into the hallway, away from the draft. I guided her to the guest room across the hall, which was untouched. "Sit on the bed." She sat. I found a blanket in the closet and wrapped it around her. She looked small, defeated. "Sterling is coming tomorrow," she whispered. "He'll see the window. He'll see the damage. He'll say the house is unsafe. He'll cancel the grant." "He won't," I said. I knelt in front of her, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough to block the draft from the door, because by the time he gets here, it won't look like a disaster. It'll look like a repair in progress. She looked at me, her eyes wet. "Why are you doing this? It's not your job. You're a student. You shouldn't be here holding up walls." "You asked for help," I said simply. "I don't leave a job halfway done. It's not just the job, is it?" The question hung in the cold air. I looked at her. I wanted to touch her face. I wanted to wipe the smudge of dust from her cheek. But the semester wasn't over. The grade wasn't filed. The boundary was still there, even if the storm had blown it open. "No," I admitted, my voice rough. "It's not just the job." She let out a shaky breath. "I'm scared, Silas. Not of the storm. Of failing. Of losing this place. It's the last thing my father left me." "You won't lose it." "How do you know?" "Because I'm not going to let it fall down." It was the most arrogant thing I had ever said. And yet, looking at her, I knew it was true. I would hold the roof up with my bare hands if I had to. "Try to sleep," I said, standing up. "I have to go secure the perimeter." I walked to the door. "Silas." I stopped. "You're really good at this," she said softly. "Saving things. Only the things that matter," I said. I didn't sleep. I spent the night turning the disaster into a controlled variable. I went to the basement and found plywood. I cut it to size. I went outside, into the storm, and secured the window from the exterior using screws and silicone sealant I found in the truck. The wind bit through my jacket, but I didn't feel it. I was in the algorithm. Problem. Solution. Next. I cleared the debris from the porch. I swept the snow from the hallway. I moved her papers to a dry box. By 6 a.m., the storm had passed. The house was wounded, but it was standing. The heat was humming. The coffee was brewing. I sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the structural integrity of the porch roof on my tablet. At 7 a.m., a black sedan crunched up the gravel drive. Dean Sterling. Early. A power move. I watched through the window as a man in a pristine camel hair coat stepped out. He looked at the boarded-up window, then at the pile of cut branches I had neatly stacked to the side. He frowned. He looked disappointed that the house hadn't collapsed. Alina came down the stairs. She was dressed in her professor armor blazer, slacks, hair tight, but her eyes were terrified. She saw the car. "He's here," she whispered. "Look at the window. It looks like a war zone." "It looks like a secured site," I corrected. "Let him in. I'm finishing the incident report." "Report? Go." She opened the door. Dean Sterling swept in, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He was accompanied by a shorter man carrying a clipboard, the university architect. "Professor Taylor," Sterling said, his voice smooth and oily. I see we've had some structural failures. As I feared, this property is a liability." "It was a storm, Dean," Alina said, her voice shaking slightly. "A freak accident." "Accidents are a sign of poor maintenance," Sterling sniffed. He looked at the plywood. "And this makeshift repair. It's hardly up to code. I think we've seen enough, haven't we, Bob? The grant money would be better spent on a new facility, one without rot." Alina flinched. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but nothing came out. She was back in the faculty lounge, being talked over. I stood up. I didn't smooth my shirt. I didn't smile. I projected the energy of a man who charges $200 an hour for a consult and is currently undercharging. "Silas Reyes," I said, stepping between Alina and Sterling. "Contractor and structural consultant for the Historic Preservation Grant." Sterling blinked, looking at my boots, then my face. I wasn't aware Professor Taylor had hired consultants. "The budget is being managed efficiently," I interrupted. I picked up my tablet. "I've just completed the post-storm assessment. The damage to the west fenestration is superficial. The structural members are intact. In fact, the emergency response protocols Professor Taylor implemented prevented significant water damage to the interior assets." I turned the screen to the architect. I had whipped up a CAD drawing of the window repair, complete with load calculations and thermal resistance values. It looked official. It looked expensive. "As you can see," I continued, overwhelming them with data, "the prompt remediation actually demonstrates the viability of the site. Most administrators would have panicked. Professor Taylor secured the asset. That's the kind of leadership this retreat center needs. Crisis management." The architect leaned in, adjusting his glasses. "These load calcs? Did you run these this morning?" "I ran them at 4 a.m., I said. "The sheer strength of the repair exceeds county code by a factor of 3. Sterling looked at the screen, then at Alina, then at the boarded window, which looked professionally secured, not slapped together. He looked for a loose thread to pull. He couldn't find one. "I see," Sterling stammered. "Well, the paperwork? The incident report is drafted and queued for upload," I said calmly. It wasn't a lie. I had the draft on my screen. I just hadn't hit send yet. "Along with the invoice for the emergency stabilization." Alina was staring at me. Her mouth was slightly open. She looked from me to Sterling, and something shifted in her face. The fear evaporated. "Silas is correct," she said, her voice finding its steel. "And frankly, Dean, if you're questioning the structural integrity of this house, you might want to question why the university hasn't released the maintenance funds I requested 6 months ago. The paper trail on that is quite extensive." Sterling paled. "Now, Alina, there's no need to bring the board into this." "Excellent," she said, stepping forward. "Then I assume the site visit is concluded?" "We have repairs to finish." She opened the door. Sterling adjusted his coat, muttered a goodbye, and retreated to his sedan. When the door clicked shut, the silence stretched. Alina slumped against the wall. "You handled him." "I provided data," I corrected. "You handled him." "You opened the door." She walked over to me. She was close. Too close. I could count the eyelashes on her lower lid. "You saved my tenure," she said. "I fixed a window." "Silas." She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were warm. "Stop hiding behind the work. I looked down at our hands. My knuckles were scarred, stained with oil. Hers were smooth, ink-stained. The contrast was stark. "I have to hide behind the work," I said quietly, "because I'm still your student. For 3 more weeks." She froze. Then slowly, she smiled. "3 weeks," she whispered. "I can be patient." We spent the next 6 weeks in a strange, bifurcated reality. During the week, on campus, we were professional. I sat in the back. She lectured at the front. But there was a frequency between us now, a bandwidth that no one else could access. I noticed when she rubbed her left temple, migraine pending, and I'd leave a bottle of water on her desk before class, positioning it exactly parallel to her notebook. She noticed when I was burying myself in tech manuals, and she'd drop a book of poetry on my bench with a sticky note. Read. Decompress. The waiting was a physical wait. 2 weeks left. I was sitting in her final lecture on Friday afternoon. The hall was packed. She was speaking about Jane Eyre and the concept of equal partnership. "Jane doesn't return to Rochester as a nurse," Alina said, her voice ringing clear. "She returns as an equal. Independence is the prerequisite for union." She looked up from her notes. Her eyes scanned the room, bypassing the front rows, bypassing the eager hands raised. Her gaze found me in the back corner. She didn't smile. She just held my eyes for 3 seconds. A look that acknowledged the calendar. A look that said, "I'm counting too." I checked my watch. 408 hours. I adjusted the cuff of my shirt, covering the watch face, and leaned back. I could wait. I restored the Jaguar completely. I returned it to her. I didn't charge her for the labor. I submitted my final thesis. She graded it. An A. The transcript was finalized. The degree was conferred. I was no longer a student. I was an alumnus. I was working late at the garage on a Tuesday, 2 days after graduation. It was raining again. The sound of rain usually calmed me. But tonight, it felt like a clock ticking. The bay door rolled up. Alina stood there. She looked out of place among the hydraulic lifts and oil drums, like a first edition book in a hardware store. She was wet, her hair plastered to her cheeks. "The house is finished," she said. "The contractors you hired completed the roof today." "Good," I said, wiping a wrench. "It'll stand for another 100 years. Silas, stop." She walked into my space. She didn't care about the grease. She didn't care about the noise. "The grant is approved. The tenure is approved. Everything is fixed." "Mission accomplished," I said, not looking at her. "You don't need the consultant anymore." "Then why does it feel like I'm losing the most important part?" She placed a hand on the fender of the Mustang I was working on. "I told Dean Sterling about us," she said. I dropped the wrench. It clanged loudly on the concrete. "You what?" "I told him that the structural consultant is my partner, and that since you've graduated and the grades are filed, if the university has a policy against happiness, they can keep their tenure." I stared at her. "Alina, you worked 10 years for that position. You obsessed over it. You lived in that freezing house for it, and I spent 36 years waiting for someone who didn't try to change me," she countered. "You didn't fix me, Silas. You didn't try to make me less chaotic or less overwhelmed. You just reinforced the walls, so it was safe for me to be imperfect." She took a step closer. "I don't want the house if you're not coming up the driveway on Fridays." I looked at her, this brilliant, chaotic, formidable woman who had just nuked her safety net for a mechanic. I walked around the car. I didn't put my hands in my pockets this time. I reached out and took her face in my hands. My thumbs traced her cheekbones. "I'm opening my own shop," I told her. "Custom design and restoration. No more student loans. No more back row." "That sounds efficient," she smiled, tears in her eyes. "It's a terrifying risk," I admitted, "but the variable analysis suggests the ROI is worth it." "Kiss me, you nerd," she whispered. I leaned in. It wasn't an explosion. It was the click of a bolt seating perfectly home. It was the sound of an engine finally catching, smooth and powerful, ready to run. I held her like I was securing the most valuable asset in the world. Beat 10. Resolution. 2 months later, the department holiday party was held at the Blackwood Lake house. It was the official unveiling of the retreat center. The fire was roaring in the hearth I had cleaned. The windows were sealed tight against the winter wind. Dean Sterling was there, taking credit for the renovation. I stood by the fireplace, wearing a charcoal suit that I'd had tailored precision fit. I felt the imposter syndrome try to creep in, but then I looked at the window frame. I knew what was under the paint. I knew the strength of the steel screws holding it together. I knew I belonged there because I had built the safety that allowed them to be there. Alina stood at the front of the room, raising a glass. This house, she said to the faculty, was falling down. It was saved not by administrative oversight, but by hands-on dedication. We often talk about literature as the preservation of the soul, but sometimes preservation requires steel, wood, and the courage to face the storm. She looked across the room, directly at me. "I'd like to introduce the lead consultant on this project," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and my partner, Silas Reyes." The room went quiet. Sterling choked on his canapé. Then, applause. I walked over to her. I didn't hide. I stood beside her, my hand finding the small of her back a public claim, a structural support. "You did good, Professor," I murmured. She leaned into me. "We did good, Silas." Later, as the guests were leaving, I handed her a small box. Inside was a key. Not to the house, she already had that. "The shop," I said. "I signed the lease today. It's got a loft office. Quiet, good lighting, perfect for grading papers." She closed her fingers around the key. "Is there a kettle?" "Industrial grade," I promised. "Boils in 40 seconds. And I installed a dedicated gas line so you never have to worry about the regulator." She smiled, and for the first time, I saw no fatigue in her face, only future. The end. Closing thoughts. Maintenance log. Entry final. Love isn't a factory new part that you plug in and forget. It's a living system. It requires regular diagnostics, preventative maintenance, and the occasional emergency repair in the middle of a storm. Don't look for someone who is perfect. Look for someone who shows up with the right tools when the engine stalls. Engagement. If you enjoyed this story of repair and resilience, please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.